You must never attack civilians, and indiscriminate attacks are prohibited. An attack is indiscriminate if it isn't directed at a specific military objective, or if it's not possible to limit its effects as required by the law of armed conflict. Under the law of armed conflict, all objects, except for military objectives, are civilian, and are therefore protected. Civilian objects include houses, schools, civilian public buildings, and objects used for humanitarian aid. In addition, the law of armed conflict gives special protection to certain objects, either because people need them in order to survive or because destroying them will cause particular harm to civilians. These specially protected objects include medical facilities, religious buildings, and cultural sites. You must not attack medical facilities, whether civilian or military. You must not attack hospitals, ambulances, and other vehicles with a medical function, tents and open-air or underground installations. Cultural sites are of great importance to our universal cultural heritage. You must not attack them. Medical facilities are still protected, even when they're treating wounded soldiers or fighters. That's not a military activity. It's part of their basic humanitarian role. If medical facilities are used for military purposes, then, following a warning, they may lose their protection. However, any operations against them must still comply with the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Civilians are protected under the law of armed conflict. Police officers, firefighters, and civil defense personnel are also civilians. Some groups have special protection, such as medical and religious personnel, both civilian and military, journalists, and humanitarian aid workers. These people retain their protected status unless they participate directly in hostilities. Most of today's armed conflicts are non-international. Increasingly, fighting takes place in areas where there are civilians. In some cases, fighters wear civilian clothing. Civilians often participate directly in military operations. All of these factors make it difficult to distinguish between combatants and civilians. This increasingly complex battlefield is also making it more difficult for commanders, soldiers, and other fighters to apply the law of armed conflict, especially when it comes to the principle of distinction and the question of who is a legitimate target. Often, you will have no more than a few seconds to decide whether you can legitimately target an individual, so you need to understand how to apply the law. If you take the wrong decision, you may end up killing a civilian who is not directly participating in hostilities. Under the principle of distinction, members of the armed forces are a legitimate target unless they are medical or religious personnel who are protected at all times, or wounded, surrendering, or captured soldiers, who are also protected against attack. Members of armed groups with a continuous combat function, such as fighters, are also legitimate targets at all times, unless they are wounded, are surrendering, or have been captured. However, this does not apply to people associated with an armed group who don't have a combat function, such as those involved in political or administrative activities, supporters and sympathizers of the group, relatives of fighters, medical or religious personnel. These people all have the protected status of civilians and you may not attack them. You must not attack civilians unless they commit an act that constitutes direct participation in hostilities. In this case, they lose their protected status for the duration of that act. What constitutes direct participation in hostilities? In combat, how can you know when a civilian has lost their protected status and has become a legitimate target? In order for a civilian to lose their protection, the answer to all three of the following questions must be yes. Is the civilian committing an act causing concrete harm to the military force, such as killing or wounding military personnel, or disrupting a military operation, or causing concrete harm to a protected object or person? Is there a direct link between the act and the harm caused? Acts that contribute to the general military effort, such as working in an ammunition factory, do not constitute direct participation in hostilities, because they're not linked to a specific act causing concrete harm. Did the civilian commit the act designed to support one party by harming another? Delivering ammunition to the front line could be regarded as direct participation in hostilities. The delivery of ammunition to a port for shipping to a conflict zone would not be regarded as direct participation in hostilities, because it's too remote from military operations. If it's not totally clear that civilians carried out an act in order to deliberately cause direct harm, civilians remain protected, and it is illegal to attack them. A civilian loses his protected status for the duration of the act. However, you should only attack a civilian participating directly in hostilities if there is no other way of stopping him committing the act. Once the civilian has stopped participating directly in hostilities, he regains his protected status and you may no longer target him. However, he may still be arrested if there are legal grounds for the arrest. The direct participation of civilians in hostilities is a fact on the modern battlefield, and a challenging issue for commanders and their personnel. If there is any doubt as to whether all three criteria are met, you must treat the individual as a civilian with protected status.